Howdy, everybody. Chest College, Humanities 4 through Film Studies. How are you doing? Monday morning blues. Hope you had a decent weekend. It's wants to look like it wants to rain, but nothing out there is happening much, but it's a lot of clouds. Anyway, hope you're doing well, not just talking about the weather and boring the hell out of everybody. Um, well, we're advancing right along. I'll be signing the next essay. It's going to be a foreign film. You're going to have to watch it and do your best analysis of it. More on that later. I'll sign at the end of the week. It's going to be one of two films, 400 Blows by Francois Truffaut. You could look for it right now. Or Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard. And both French films, both changed the entire industry of cinema throughout the world, especially in Hollywood. Hard to believe, a French film, little French film, a little art film coming out of France changed how the new breed of directors that were coming out of film school, guys like Francis Ford Coppola, who did, that's right, The Godfathers, Apocalypse Now. George Lucas, maybe you've heard of him. He did a little thing called Star Wars. Steven Spielberg, Jaws. Do I need to go on about Steve Spielberg? No, I don't. Martin Scorsese coming out of New York City with Mean Streets and Raging Bull and the rest of his wonderful work. Terrence Malick, 70s director, who's still out there. One of the best directors, unique voices we've ever seen or heard or looked at. I'll be talking about those films probably the next 2 weeks. We're not there yet. Badlands would be his first film, and it is a masterpiece. Seek it out if you can. Hal Ashby, who was an editor and went on to direct some of the best films of the 70s, like Shampoo, cutting edge stuff, Being There, Bound for Glory, masterful. And he was working in standard Hollywood. Robert Altman's another one. All who directed MASH and Nashville and so many others, these are all coming out of a different mindset in Hollywood. They were film students, some of them, alternative types, early work, some of them worked in early television, but they had high ideals to how to tell a story to a new generation of students and who were coming up out of the sleepy 1950s into the 1960s and into a world of civil rights movement, women's rights, the Vietnam War, assassinations of our president, of our civic leaders, Martin Luther King, rock and roll was changing the landscape. The French New Wave, which is what I'm going to talk about today and what you're going to write your next paper about, was a little started in France, Paris, and there was a magazine there called Kane de Cinema, Notes on Cinema. And they took cinema very seriously. They made it an academic, not just a like or dislike or celebrity gossip. They didn't care about that. They cared about the content of movies, and mostly it was coming out of America. They loved John Ford and Hitchcock, and they died, and they loved our film noir. They looked at those films, they analyzed those films, and they wrote about them as if they were literature. They're no different than Shakespeare or John Steinbeck or Ernest Hemingway. That's how seriously they took the cinema. A lot more serious than we took it in this country. We were still wondering who Rock Hudson was dating, or if Tallulah Bankhead was a lesbian or not, or whatever happened to the movie stars of old, like Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe, all those people. Who were they dating? Who they sleep with? Who cares? They French didn't. They were looking at cinema as literature, a visual literature. And so they helped resurrect Orson Welles' career by writing seriously about Citizen Kane. They saw it as a serious piece of cinema literature that went above a lot of people's heads when it first came out because it was not a success. Plus, it had the misfortune of coming out the same week we had Pearl Harbor. Everybody's mind was not on the cinema. It was on other things like a world war. Uh, and they looked at Citizen Kane and Orson Welles and his 3 or 4 films they made, Citizen Kane, Magnificent Ambersons, and um, my favorite Orson Welles film, which was made in the late 50s, actually, film noir. Um, I'm forgetting the title right now. It's horrible. I love that movie too. I'll come back to it. I'll get it. Anyway, they wrote about it like he's the auteur of his work. Auteur is a French word. Come on, who took French out there? Author, simply author. That wasn't happening. What that simply means, they had a style. They had a visual style, a visual stamp, a literary stamp. You could look at an Orson Welles film and you could spot it, even if you don't know who directed it or who wrote it. Same with Alfred Hitchcock. Their visual style, their personal stamp was so strong that you could see it without even knowing if before you said the credits. There was a few Hollywood directors that had a very strong personal stamp, like Howard Hawks, for one. They studied him, and he worked within the Hollywood system forever, his whole career, but he had this personal stamp that he could put on all his films. So he just wasn't a cookie cutter director just doing the job that the Hollywood factory told him to do. Same thing with John Ford. They had the power to have a personal vision that went beyond the cutest movie star that they had to have in their movies or what was best for the box office. Yes, they had their eye on the box office. That's a natural thing. Not so much the French New Wave guys. They didn't have the luxury of all that money from Hollywood. There was really no film industry there. There was not much support. And some of these writers that wrote about cinema in Cahiers de Cinema, and they wrote about our American directors in such a reverential academic way. Of course, they wanted to direct their own films. So, film students in this country, which film schools are starting to pop up everywhere from USC to UCLA to Columbia to New York University, San Francisco State, where I went, um, we're studying cinema and they're studying Cahiers de Cinema, which has an English translation edition. And we're looking at the essays of these, our own films given back to us. If you know anything about rock and roll, and let's say the Beatles or especially the Rolling Stones, Yardbirds, the British blues bands that came out of the earliest, what they call British invasion, from them to Yardbirds, which spawned Led Zeppelin. You heard of them, haven't you? And which was coming from American blues with a rock and roll aspect to it. Rolling Stones never wanted to do anything else besides blues covers from famous guys in America, from Robert Johnson to Howlin' Wolf to how so many of them I can't keep track. BB King, obviously, and they blues meant so much to them because they could get these records and then they put their take on it. They put their rock and roll instruments on a Muddy Waters tune, and it elevated it up until this and it was called the British Invasion. Yes, the Beatles were part of it, but they weren't a blues band. But bands like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds and them were bringing along the blues, John Mayall, and people were just like, "This music's great," and they go, "It's American music. We didn't write these songs." And people go, "What?" So white British musicians with electric guitars were reinventing the blues and they were giving it back in the form of records and concerts and touring America to American audiences, and yet it was our music. We just didn't pay attention to it. During this era in our time of music, it was the Everly Brothers, who I love, but it was Pat Boone and a lot of white guys singing rock and roll in a rather generic, safe way. The black musicians in this country, like B.B. King and Little Richard, didn't have an outlet. Yes, they did. They had black radio and they had what they called the Chitlin Circuit. That's where they toured, not in white cities. And but they went to Europe and their careers were really elevated because the British musicians loved these guys and they backed them up at their concerts. That's how they got famous, by backing these legendary African American artists from America. So in a way, the French New Wave was similar than that. They are taking our cinema, the cinema of John Ford, Howard Hawks, Alfred Hitchcock, and giving it back to Americans through their own visual style, their language. By the way, these are all in French. You have to read the subtitles, folks. And they were giving it back to us because their passion was Hollywood cinema, believe it or not. And so a film like Breathless, which is a tribute to Humphrey Bogart movies, the with the femme fatale, definitely kind of follows the film noir aspect, although it's not filmed like Hollywood film noir. It's filmed differently. 400 Blows is a story about Francois Truffaut, who directed it. It's about his essentially childhood as kind of a juvenile delinquent in grammar school. And it's a beautiful shot in black and white, more traditionally than Breathless was. And they filmed it on the streets in Paris where they could get uh, the locations without paying for them. They filmed with, for the most part, actors nobody had ever seen before. Uh, Breathless had an American movie star who Jean Seberg had gone to Europe because her acting career at the age of 21 had fizzled here in America. She'd been in an Preminger movie called Joan of Arc, and she was only 19, and the film was a dismal failure. So she was feeling wounded, and so she went to Europe. I think she had a boyfriend or two there. And the French directors thought she was awesome. Well, when you watch Breathless, tell me if she's awesome or not. Um, she looks like a modern day punk rock girl from New York City. That's how modern she is and ahead of her time. Yes, she's speaking French with an American accent. And John Paul Belmondo, who just recently passed away, one of the monsters of European cinema. Not handsome, but obviously a lot of charisma and appeal towards women and men. We love John Paul Belmondo, and he did some seminal European films that put Europe, especially France, on the map. So these French New Wave films, that's what they called them because it was a new wave, not the old wave. Just like the Beatles were, they called that the British Invasion, Part One. Part Here come the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, the Animals, the Kinks, Animals. That's part one. But later on in the 60s, there was another British invasion, which consisted of bands like The Who and Pink Floyd, and then later on it would be Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. And then in the 70s, it'd be punk rock with The Clash and the Sex Pistols. So the British keep hitting more more invasions on us. But now when these films in French New Wave were happening, pop culture was changing. Yes, the world is in a Cold War, but France is kind of on the out of it because they're not the US, which was the target of Soviet Union. They're not Germany, which had the Berlin Wall because the Soviets had owned half of East Berlin and they put a wall up there to keep people out. No, that's not it, folks, to keep people in. Nobody wanted to go in there. You had no freedoms, no not it was pretty bad. That's what Russians did in those days. They walled their citizens in. They didn't want them to escape. And you know what, folks? They wanted to escape. Some of them were killed jumping over the wall. You could be shot for it. Yes, they killed their own citizens who wanted to live in the West, to live in a free culture of expression and democracy. You know, a country is corrupt when their citizens want to escape it. And at the threat of death, that keeps them from escaping. But some had the courage to leave. That was going on in Germany. Well, France was coming out of World War II. They'd been occupied by Nazis. They were making a comeback with culture and art, and France never got bombed. Or I should say, Paris never got bombed. So, like, unlike so many European cities, which were in rubble, Berlin, mostly German cities, of course, but cities in Greece, cities in Italy were rubble because they've been bombed by the Nazi regime. That's what they do, folks. They bomb people's countries because they're trying to force their ways on everybody. Look what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Same thing. So the French came out of that and they had these artists who didn't have the money to make these films. They were writing for the Cahiers de Cinema and they were lecturing about films and going to see the local films at their cinematique. And there was a revolution going on there of new ideas and how to make films that weren't Hollywood films because they don't have the money for the sets and the costumes and the fancy movie stars, but they could make their own way. So Jean-Luc Godard, uh, who was very, very influenced by American films, especially Humphrey Bogart films, meaning he starred in them, but Howard Hawks and others directed them. He did Breathless, and he broke all the rules in cinema. Yes, folks, when you go to college to study film, I'm not talking about what we're doing. I'm talking about the actual filmmaking. There's all sorts of rules. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't change just the position, you can't change eye line, you can't do any of that. He didn't follow any of that. Now, my take on it is he wasn't breaking these rules on purpose. I just think he didn't know filmmaking that well, and these things happen. I've made several films, and you do get this stuff messed up. People's eye line, who they're talking to, what they're talking to. That takes direction and someone who knows film making. And so I believe he was making mistakes, and they were beautiful mistakes, just like punk rock, just like rock and roll. It's all about the mistakes, folks. That's what makes it human. Um, he used an editing. You take editing in a class, and the first thing they teach you is what they call seamless editing, parallel editing, all these. I don't need to talk to you about it. If you have your book, How to Write About Movies, it's in there. It explains all these terms, which really helps you write your papers. Hope you guys get the book one day. It's going to help because I can see the ones that don't have the book. I could tell by your essays. Anyway, he did Jean-Luc Godard did what they call jump cuts, and that's a no-no in film school. And if you see Breathless, you'll see what a jump cut is. I'm going to show you before you have to watch those two movies. I'll show you a couple short little documentaries on the French New Wave, and they talk about the techniques. And he took a handheld camera out there, kind of like a newsreel footage, and um, it makes it more real. It's filmed outside on real locations, kind of like very much influenced by the Italian neorealism, because that's how they got the shots. And even if passerbys are walking by and they look into the camera, it didn't matter. You don't see that in Hollywood. Everybody who walks by a camera is an extra, paid extra. And that's why you never see the people looking at cameras or gawking at the actors because they're fake, folks. They're not real pedestrians. Now, he broke all those rules. He's the guy that came up with the great quotes. Everything is cinema. Truth at 24 frames a second. He's 90 years old now, maybe older, and he's still making another film. Um, Never stopped believing in cinema. Now he's filming in the digital realm. Yes, folks, with all the new equipment, digital films give you, and his iPhone, the whole bit. He's making very artistic, fragmented films, not easy to follow, but there's a lot of beauty in them and creativity in them. And he's 90 years old and he's still in the game. Francois Truffaut was more conservative in his film techniques. He had nice composed shots with dolly tracks, putting the camera on the tripod and filming more in traditional way. His main influence visually was Alfred Hitchcock and other Americans. And his 400 Blows was a revolution because it won at the Cannes Film Festival for Best Film. About this 12-year-old boy caught up in the system and how he kind of strikes back at it. And we'll talk more about that when we get close to it. I'll show you the rough cuts of these, though, in Canvas. So look at them. I'm going to put them out there tonight. Anyway, I hope everything's going good. That's all I'm going to talk about right now. There were very few women in the scene. There was no women. There was one director, Agnes Varda, who was married to another director, Jean Demy. I think that's how you say his name. Jacques Demy, sorry. And who had a successful career. I wouldn't consider him the French New Wave. His films were more formal and kind of fairy tale like almost in a way. Agnes Varda came on the scene with a film called Chloe from 9 to 5 about a very attractive woman who goes to the doctor and the doctor says she might have cancer. So she spends the rest of the day wandering around Paris. And that's all she's doing is wandering, folks, thinking she might have a terminal disease. It's who she meets. She meets some handsome people. Melancholy film, filmed in the French New Wave style by a woman, folks. At the end of the movie, she finds out she is cancer free, so she wants to live. Anyway, we'll talk about Agnes Varda later when I talk about women directors in a couple weeks. What else? That is it. Keep up on your journals. Are you doing that? Once a week, general entries on what I say in these lectures, on what you read in your books, on what you see in the documentaries, possibly, and not just what you're doing and saying and talking in discussions, but how'd you feel about it? What's your reflection? I don't think I still have posted a sample. I'm going to do that tonight. So look for a sample of what I'm looking for of the journal. On that note, Keep watching films and keep looking deeper. Always go deeper. See you next time when the story film continues.